everyone, what's up? My name is Joss and welcome back to my channel, Squibbles Reads. Today I'm going to be doing the big video. It is books 1 through 8 of 2016. If you can tell from my shelf, I have taken down some of the forward-facing books, so I will be letting you guys know about those books in this video. These books are super hard to differentiate between in terms of like the ranking on my top books of 2016. They're all so different in terms of scope, theme, characters, writing style, you name it, they are all so different. So they are all totally amazing in different ways. I also did the favorite videos of 2016 on Marinez from My Name is Marinez's video. So I did have to pick one book for that, and trust me, it was very difficult. So I will save that book for the very last book in this video. The books that I mentioned today are all 5-star books that I rated 5 stars. I cried in most of these books except for one, which is the first one that I'm going to talk about. So that is really significant because, to be quite frank, I do more eye rolling than I do crying in a lot of the books that I read. So without any further ado, let's get into it. The first book that I'm going to talk about is actually a fantasy book, and it is the first book in the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson called The Final Empire, and I was honestly so surprised that I liked this as much as I did because it was one of the first books that I read in 2016, but also just from a technical standpoint, as a reader, it really helped my world building skills. So I appreciated this just as like evolving as a reader, if that makes sense. This is kind of hard to explain, but it is a heist. So this is in a world where everything is kind of covered in ash, and there is an evil ruler, and this dude named Kelsier is trying to overthrow that ruler with another girl named Vin. The magic system revolves around different metals, and when those metals are ingested, they give the people who are ingesting them different skills, and different people can use different types and different numbers of metals. I would just really recommend this. It's just good, solid high fantasy. So if that's something that you are interested in, or if you are looking to get into high fantasy, that is kind of the point that I was at when I read this book, and I was very pleasantly surprised. So I gave it 5 stars. All these books I gave 5 stars, but yeah, 5 stars. The next 2 are books that I ordered right away after reading them from the library, which, to be completely honest, is very rare for me. So I have books that I own and I read because I own them, and then I also have books that I borrow from the library and that I really enjoy, but I return them and I don't buy them again. But these are both books that I purchased right away because I loved them so much. The first one is a short story collection by Ramona Ostubel. It's called A Guide to Being Born. I read this as a buddy read with Rachel from Reader on the Right, and we did just so much like analysis and dissection of like every single word in this, and not because we're like especially analytical readers, but because every word and really like every syllable and variation of word was significant. So everything that was put on the page was for a reason, and I loved that. I don't even know how to describe like the actual like plot of the stories, if that makes sense, but only like I feel like this short story collection is really defined by the writing style. So each story was 15 to 20 pages long, and it was just layer upon layer of nuance, and those layers fit together absolutely perfectly. So I DNF'd 4 books in a row after I read this book because each story is 15 to 20 pages long, and those 4 books that I DNF'd were all around like 400 pages, and about 150 pages in, I would be like, I've read literally 10 times the amount of pages that one of these short stories is, and I am not nearly as emotionally invested or moved, and I don't see those layers and nuances in the writing, so I just DNF'd them because I was so obsessed with this short story collection. The other book that I ordered was, oh my god, I'm so obsessed with this book. This book is And Again by Jessica Chiarella, and if you have stuck with me throughout this year, you will have heard about this book quite a few times, and you can really tell that I love it because I annotate when I love things. This is about 4 individuals that were chosen to participate in this scientific experiment where they received and were put into, I guess, like unaltered versions of their body. I'm not sure if unaltered is the best way to describe how the science experiment went, but basically any illnesses that they had were like magically cured, but also any kind of like tattoos, piercings, hair dye, stuff like that, those were all removed. Which is so interesting because it looked at the ways that humans value or don't value certain things, like appearance and the ways that they modify their body and like physical health, mental health, all of that stuff. And all the characters were definitely flawed, but these themes were explored in a way that made me as a reader be like, what would I do in that situation? So for example, there was a girl who had tattoos and her body came back after the experiment and she did not have tattoos anymore, and she chose to not get those tattoos again because the experience of getting them and what she was going through at the time was more significant for her than the actual ink in her skin. And I feel like that's one of those things that if you asked any person with tattoos, I feel like every person would have a different answer. I feel like this is also one of those books where your judgments of the characters, when I read it, I was like, I'm judging this character, but what would I have really done in that situation? I don't know. As you can tell, I really, really love this book. If you've seen more than 2 of my videos, you've probably heard me talk about it. So yeah, just really love it. Another one of my favorite books of 2016 was Homegoing by Ya Jessie. I did do a full review of this book, so I will leave that link in the down bar below. So I won't get too much into it, but this is a multi-generational family saga. So it spans hundreds of years, about like 8 generations, and we go from Ghana to the United States. We start off with 2 half-sisters, Afia and Essie. One of them is married to a white man. They are both Ghanaian, and the other one is forced into the slave trade. It really helped me understand how systemic racism is because we go so far back into history, but also because oftentimes we group people in terms of like ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, but we see these people in groups and not as individuals, which is part of what is so dehumanizing. But this book really stressed the importance of not listening to one single story, but listening to a broad variety of stories, because each individual story, even though they may belong to certain groups, is important. In this book, we really see each individual and how their stories differ and how they change over time. The sheer scope of this book is just so impressive because it does all of that in this little tiny book that's just a little bit over 300 pages. I had the great opportunity to meet Ya Jessie at BEA, and she did sign this book, which is a finished copy, and she did address it to me, which is so exciting. This next book, also one that I hella talk about, and it's the only one on this list that I don't own, which does make me kind of sad, but in due time, I will own it. This is Shelter by Jung Yoon. We have Kyung, who is a Korean man who is married to Jillian, who is a Caucasian woman. One day, Kyung encounters a woman in his yard who is walking towards him, and she's wearing very little clothes, maybe no clothes if I remember correctly, but anyways, she is full of physical injuries, and you can see them on her body, on her skin, and she, unfortunately, is someone that Kyung knows. So starting from this, the story unravels. We go into some family history and just different microaggressions and stereotypes that all of these people encounter in society. The book is very dialogue and plot focused in terms of the writing, so it did move very quickly, and I did read it very quickly. In hindsight, I do wish that I had read it a little bit more slowly, but I think that it reflects upon that kind of buildup of emotion and how it like just comes at you in waves and waves, and you're just kind of like stuck with all of distress, and sitting with the discomfort is part of what the experience is as a reader. I'm not sure if that makes any sense, but that's kind of how I felt it. Like it was just all at once, and I think that's very similar to what the characters experienced in the book. The dialogue did also help the book be very person-centered. Again, I do wish that I had read it more slowly, but there is always ample time for a reread in the future. The next book that I'm going to talk about, also another one that if you watched like more than 2 of my videos, you've probably heard of this book and how much I love it. This is Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. It is about Agnes, who was convicted of murder in Iceland. In the year 1829, there was a priest whose name is Toti, and he kind of takes her under his wing, like spiritually, and takes care of her. She goes to live on a farm with a family, and we get to see the unraveling of the mystery of the murder and kind of all the people that surrounded the murder and maybe were involved in it. The best way that I can describe this book is atmospheric and bleak and heartbreaking. The writing is absolutely the highlight of Burial Rites. It manages to be sharp and serene and almost like foggy all at the same time. I don't know how to explain it, but that's just kind of like the atmosphere that it evokes. Like it made me feel cold inside, like emotionally cold and kind of unforgiving. I think that's a better way to explain it. Like I literally just can't even with this writing. Like it's just amazing. It is listed as a thriller on Goodreads. I'm not quite sure why, because this is not a thriller. Like the highlight is really the writing here. And if you're going into it looking for a thriller, I would suggest another book, but it's just so good, but it's not a thriller. So I do have 2 books left. This next one, I was so close to picking it for the favorite books collab. Like literally you could have flipped a coin and it may have ended up on this book. Could have used this book, but it didn't end up that way. But if you've heard me talk, this is Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng, and plenty of annotations downside, again, how you can tell that I love a book. This is about Lydia, and she is a young girl whose body was found in a small town. She's the daughter of a Chinese man named James and a Caucasian woman named Marilyn. We follow their family's grief and anguish and trying to figure out what happened to her and how they react as they find certain things out. It is a little tiny book, but it covers all of the different microaggressions that Marilyn experiences because she is a woman at that time. It is in the 1970s in a small town, and also the microaggressions that James experiences because of his ethnicity and the way that he looks, again, because of the time and setting where they live. Both of these things are things that I have experienced myself, which is why it kind of hit home so hard. Again, a really tiny book, but it just like explodes with energy and great writing and sharpness. It just has this like sharp quality that I really love about it. I will also leave my full review of Everything I Never Told You down in the down bar below. The last book that I'm going to talk about, I think, is my #1 book of the year. And this is Jane Steele by Lindsay Faye. So Jane Steele is inspired by Jane Eyre, but is really not a retelling of Jane Eyre. So Jane Steele herself is the heroine of our book, and she really loves the book Jane Eyre. She draws a lot of parallels from it, and there are definitely parallels in her own life, but it is very much its own story. So Jane Steele meets these men that commit violent, heinous crimes against women, some of them in a really graphic and sexual nature, which she absolutely hates, so she murders these men. It is written from her point of view, so we see how distressed and guilty she feels, but also just how angry and helpless she feels. That conflict of her emotions eats at her throughout this whole book. Also a subplot that involves some new characters and the Anglo-Sikh War, so introducing some history, some people of a different ethnicity, and that also starts a little bit of a mystery subplot. Again, there is also some amazing swoon-worthy romance in here. The language is definitely very much inspired by Charlotte Bronte, and that just kind of added to that passion and that angst. Ugh, so good. I kind of felt this like little bubble of something in my stomach in the last 10 pages, and I think that's the moment where I knew that this would be probably my favorite book of the year. So yeah, Jane Steele by Lindsay Faye. This is my favorite book of 2016. So good. Alrighty, so that is my books 1 through 8 favorite books 2016 video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know what your favorite book of 2016 is, like your numero uno. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you all in my next video. Bye!